Hi, I'm Father George, Episcopal priest, Ford truck enthusiast, and smoked brisket champion. And today I would like to share with you my experience installing the Pioneer AVH-3400NEX radio in my 1995 F-350 pickup truck. This is an awesome radio for this truck. It is a single din height radio that fits nicely into the original location and has a motorized 7-inch LCD touchscreen. It is the easiest way to add great features to your truck like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, a backup camera display, and even an aftermarket navigation system. These old Fords are also so well suited for this kind of radio. With the radio slot above the air conditioner controls and no other vents or controls above it, nothing is blocked when the screen is deployed. And doing the installation of the new radio yourself is really pretty simple. All you have to do is pull out the old radio, take out whatever bracket was left behind in there, install the new bracket that came with the new radio, and then using adapters from Metra, you can pre-wire the Pioneer radio harness so that all you have to do is plug the new harness directly into the original factory connections. And then put in the new radio, and it's a snap. However, there's a couple of things that are peculiar to this truck that would have been really nice to know ahead of time, and that's what I'd like to share with you here today. So the first thing is that in order to access the full features of the radio and all of the menu choices, you have to have the radio wired into the parking brake switch from the truck. And since this connection is not in the original factory harness, it's something you have to add, and it's simple enough to do. It is a little bit of a pain being up underneath the dash and all, but then if you do that, in order to access those features, you have to set the parking brake, unset it, and set it again, and that's just kind of annoying. So instead, what I'm doing is I'm installing this $8 circuit I bought from Amazon, and I'm wiring it directly into the radio harness to make the installation that much easier. And then this circuit tricks the radio into thinking that that parking brake cycle has been completed, and you can access all of those features at any time. And I'm sure that Pioneer frowns upon bypassing their safety system this way, and if I were installing it in my kid's car, I probably would install it properly, but I'm not. So there. Then if you want to add a backup camera to your truck, you will need a signal that tells the radio that the truck is in reverse in order to display the backup camera on the radio. And that connection also is not in the factory wiring harness, and I'll show you where we can add that from. So there's a bundle of wires that goes into the floorboard and under the floorboard towards the back. It carries power for reverse lights, signals, brake lights, things like that. And the black wire with the purple stripe is the reverse lights. And so again, I've used a T-tap here. I've just tapped onto that line to get that signal, and this is what tells the radio that you're in reverse. So it will display the camera instead of the radio. So it's really easy to get to. It's just right behind the parking brake pedal. You can see where it goes into the floor. If you pull the carpet back especially, you can see where it goes into the floor there. But it's really easy to spot, and you're looking for the black with purple wire, at least in the 1995 F-350. I'm pretty sure it's that way for most of those 90 model Fords. So another thing I learned is that the wire in the harness, which is connected to the light switch, is also connected through the ignition switch. And if you look at the original Ford wiring diagram, you can see that that is the case. Not sure why they did that, except for some reason they wanted to illuminate the radio when the truck was on, irrespective of whether the lights were on. So as you can see here, if I pull my parking lights on or my headlights on, I get the power on that wire, and if I turn those back off, you can see I'm at 0 volts there. If I turn those back off and turn the ignition switch on, there it comes again. And so the problem with that is the Pioneer radio thinks your lights are on, and if it thinks your lights are on, it thinks it's dark outside, and so it dims the radio automatically every time, whether or not you've got your lights on. So need to get that signal from a different place. Okay, so what you see here is the light control switch. I've taken it off, and if you look there in the middle of the bank of wires that goes into the switch. Right in the middle of it is this brown wire. I'm pretty sure that's the wire for the parking lights. That comes on when you pull the switch out to the first position. It stays on when you pull it all the way out, and doesn't do anything with the ignition switch, thankfully. So I'm tapping off of this, and this is what's now being fed into the radio instead of the wire that was in the original harness to signal when the lights are on. So the radio will dim or not dim, depending on the position of the lights. But the biggest issue with the radio in this truck is the behavior of the automatic screen when the truck is started. As you can see here, when the ignition switch is turned on, the screen automatically deploys. But then when the truck is started, you can see the radio power down and the screen retract. Even after the ignition switch is back in the on position, the screen fully closes and waits for a moment before deploying again. This behavior is really annoying, especially if you have like a backup camera and you're way back out of your space and long gone before the screen deploys again. Okay, what you can see here is I have my multimeter on the power lead coming to the radio that is controlled by the ignition switch. And so you can see when I turn the ignition switch to on, we get our 12 volts approximately. And but then notice what happens when I start the truck. So it looks like turning the ignition key to start disconnects that power supply from the battery bus, and then the radio is registering that as having been turned off. Now, to fix the screen issue, all it takes is a couple of inexpensive diodes and a fuse tap-borne inline fuse holder to make a connection to the radio power that will not disconnect when the truck is started. And to make things a little bit easier, it's a good idea to have a layout for your interior fuse panel already and a wiring schematic for your ignition switch. Let's begin by taking a look at the instrument fuse panel diagram from the manual. With it, we can quickly identify the key circuits to reconfigure power to the radio. First of all, we can see that position number 11 in the fuse panel powers the radio through a 15 amp fuse. Second, if we look at the fuse in position number 17, we can see that it powers things like the brake fluid level switch, warning chimes, diesel warning lamps, the instrument cluster, and so forth. These are the kinds of things that should be controlled by the ignition switch, but that should also stay powered when the ignition switch is moved to the start position. So we just need to find a way to connect these two circuits fed by the fuses in position 17 and 11. And a really easy way to do this would be to use a fuse tap to add a circuit here coming off of position 17 and tie it into the radio circuit up in the Pioneer radio harness. Unfortunately, there is only one way to install a fuse tap properly, and in my truck at least, as you will see a bit later in the video, that way is blocked by this tall circuit breaker in position number 14 for the power windows. There is just no room for a fuse tap right here. So let's take a look at the wiring diagram for the ignition switch and find the wire that feeds position number 17, so we can add a circuit with an inline fuse from it. Now, you can find wiring diagrams and other schematics for your vehicle from various sources on the internet. I use repairsurge.com. Their library is pretty extensive and their fees are somewhat reasonable. So here's the wiring diagram for the ignition switch of my truck. With it, you can trace the connections that the ignition switch makes from the engine compartment fuse box through the switch in its various positions to destination circuits in the interior fuse panel. If you look at these two here on the end, you can see that when the key is in the run position, power from the battery bus is connected through the switch to position 11 of the fuse panel that powers the radio. You can see here that there is no electrical power to the radio when the ignition switch is in the start position, so the radio powers down when the truck is started. However, if you look at this part of the switch, you can see that these circuits stay connected to electrical power when the key is turned to the start position. Interestingly enough, when the key is in the accessory position, power is connected through this part of the switch back to the circuits that include the radio. So, if we can add a circuit from here to the radio power input, then the radio will stay powered while the truck is started. Because I cannot use a fuse tap to add this circuit off of position 17 in the fuse panel, I'm going to locate this red and light green wire coming from the ignition switch to the fuse panel and tap into it using a standard wire tap. This turns out to be a 10 gauge wire, so I will be using a yellow tap. Coming off of the red and light green wire with an inline fuse holder, this new circuit will be protected with a 15 amp fuse and will be connected to the radio circuit through this diode. This diode is necessary because without it, these circuits would be powered whenever the key is in the accessory position, and we do not want that. Similarly, this diode is required so that we do not power all of these circuits when the key is in the start position. We only want to power the radio and not these others when we are starting the truck, and this diode makes that happen. So I've gathered up the components I'll need to complete the wiring harness. These include the Metra adapters to the factory harness for the radio, the parking brake bypass circuit that I mentioned earlier. Just wire this into the harness according to the instructions that come with it. The 15 amp diodes that we'll need for the added circuit we're putting in. And then of course the Pioneer wiring harness that came with the radio. Here I am connecting the Metra adapters and the Pioneer radio harness. I'm doing this by soldering, but you could just as easily use crimp connections for this. In this adapter, the red wire is the power to the radio that is controlled through the ignition switch. The yellow is connected to power all the time, the red through the ignition switch. And this is where we are going to add the circuit. So I've got my two 15 amp diodes that I'm going to attach to the power lead here. And then this way with the extension going back toward the fuse box where I've made a tap. It is really important that you connect the diodes in the proper orientation. The cathode end of both diodes goes towards the Pioneer side of the circuit. You want to make sure that the stripe side of the diode, the cathode side, is toward the Pioneer radio. And that orientation is very important for this to work correctly. Okay, so here's the fuse panel. There is position number 11, which is the 15 amp fuse that powers the radio. Here is the 10 amp fuse in position number 17. It'd be real easy for us to take a fuse tap off of that and add a circuit to it, but unfortunately that relay is right in the way, and that's just not going to work. So instead what I did is I tapped in off of this red and green wire that I got from the wiring diagram and tested it with the meter, and this is controlled by the ignition switch, and it does stay powered when the switch is moved to start. So I just tapped into that, put an inline fuse holder with a 15 amp fuse in it, just like we have in the radio circuit, and I'm going to mount that back up in here, and this is what's going to power the radio when the switch is in the start position. So here are the wires that we have. We've got the backup camera, the original Ford harness with the speaker connections and the power connections, radio antenna. Here's the USB input and the aux cord, and this is the Pioneer wiring harness connected to the Metra adapters that adapt to the original factory wiring. And you can see here I've wired into that the reverse light for the backup camera, the light switch for the automatic dimming, and this is the extra power circuit that we're adding to keep the radio from shutting during start of the truck. The transistors are up in here as well, already bundled up in there. And we've also got the microphone input for the external microphone. So I'm just going to connect the factory wiring. That stuff back into place. Now that we have the radio all installed, let's start the truck and see how it works. So the ignition switch is in the on position, the screen deploys automatically. But this time when we start the truck, the radio will stay on. And away we go. Well, that's it. I hope you found this useful and enjoyable, and until next time, Copper and I are wishing you all the best.